Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be going over doomsday prepping. Brother Smith has graciously accepted the invitation to teach this class, and I appreciate him. And I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Brother Smith.
Well, first thing I want to address a little bit is I know that this was marketed as doomsday prepping, but I want to kind of back that off a little bit because I think that doomsday prepping kind of conjures ideas of bunkers and preppers and living out in the Montana wilderness alone type of thing. And I want to focus more on sort of emergency preparation and kind of how to plan for the unplanned, and something that might be a little bit more relevant to all of us here. So for the first thing I want to do is sort of manage expectations, right? This isn't Kansas anymore, or maybe actually it kind of still is. So, if we have an emergency and it still is Kansas, like how do we, deal with that? So I'm going to open this up to people on the line here. When you think about, or what do you think about when you hear the phrase emergency preparation? What do you think we're preparing for? What type of scenarios, situations?
A plague, coronavirus.
A plague, coronavirus. That's very relevant today, isn't it?
Oftentimes I think about even preparing in case you lose a job or something relatively more common and moderate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea of financial loss, right? Job loss. Yep. What else are we thinking of?
And riots.
And riots. Yep. Anybody else?
How about a famine? All the food processing plants close down, or there's just a drought.
Food shortages, drought, absolutely. Yep. Those are all very good ones. I'll tell you what, a lot of people think in today's world, and I'm going to say this, that I think in our society, in terms of entertainment, we're sort of in the sunset of the golden age of disaster movies and television shows. If you were to go back to like 2010, like that was like the height of disaster entertainment. We had like crazy asteroid movies hitting, asteroids hitting the earth movies. We had zombie apocalypses happening. We had, the end of the world type of movies. Those are starting to become, I think, a little more few and far between, I think, because it sort of played itself out. But when you talk to people about it, I mean, these are a lot of the things that you kind of get from, like emergency preparation, like doomsday, there's few survivors, there's pandemics everywhere, and like really bad pandemics where like, dead bodies are littering the streets, and there's, super disasters where, the end of the world type of stuff, a volcano goes off and destroys half the world, these types of things. There's also like entertainment. I'm not sure if many of you have heard of the book called The Road, and it's about like this sort of disaster that happens, and it's like a guy and this girl that he sort of runs into, and there's sort of become a father-daughter type of team, and they're forced to wander like this wasteland, by themselves and try to survive. And I think that a lot of people, when they're thinking like emergency preparation, their mind immediately goes to those types of places, like, oh my gosh, we're gonna have to like live out of a backpack as we wander this, weed infested roads because there's no cars, there's no infrastructure anymore, there's no people. But really, I think you guys did pretty good. What we should be thinking about when we're planning for emergency preparation is food security, financial security, shelter. Brother Nick has his firearm out. He's ready. He's got the safety ready to go, right? He's got community. We should be thinking about communities. And I think the shift in mindset is important here, because what we should be thinking about, or what people tend to think about in emergency situations, is the emergency, right? They think like, oh my gosh, it's an earthquake. Oh my goodness, it's a famine or something like that. What we should be thinking about in terms of the preparation is what we can be doing rather than the emergency itself. What we can be doing is preparing for food security. What we can be doing is preparing for safety in our homes and our family. What we can be doing is making sure that we have shelter, right? Rather than focusing on the idea of the emergency itself. So it's a little bit of a shift of mindset, but I think it's something that's important because what it does is it puts us in active mode in terms of being able to think about what we can do and control the things that we can control versus the things that we cannot control. So, yeah, when people begin to first think about emergency preparations, they tend to focus on the extreme, right? Money isn't valuable, food's not available, you're alone, people are out to get you, you have to constantly be on the move. I mean, those are like scenarios that people start to cook up because that's the worst case scenario that they go to. And what we should be thinking about and what the whole point of emergency preparation is building a savings reserve, right? Building up food storage, planning together as a community, securing your home for a shelter in place, that type of thing that will help you get through whatever emergency is there versus, you know, getting into the scarcity mindset that is like, you know, if I don't have enough, then I don't have enough type of thing. And we've seen the scarcity mindset play out. I mean, I think if you look at the toilet paper shortage that we've run into, I mean, that's a pure scarcity mindset that has nothing to do with anything other than people freaking out about not having enough toilet paper, right? It's the craziest thing that we've seen. But if we're prepared for those types of things, then we don't have to worry about it. All right, so you guys talked about it earlier. What types of emergencies do you think that we're likely to face? You know, we talked about financial security. We talked about or like job loss. We talked about food shortages. We talked about you know, maybe a shelter-in-place pandemic type of thing. I think all of those are very valid types of scenarios that we're going to face in our lifetimes. And it's easy to envision a place where we'll need to prepare. So I learned about a kind of rational approach to getting prepared, and it's a PACE methodology. And so I like to, you know, call this portion pace yourselves as you go through preparation. So what is PACE? PACE is all about planning, right? And PACE is an acronym. And it's something that the military uses as a concept in their planning to ensure that we're considering all the possibilities that we can in the situation. And really what it means is, what it stands for is P is primary, A is alternate, C is contingent, and E is emergency. So primary is what the thing that you would use in your everyday life, right? Not easy peasy. Alternate is what is your general backup for that. A contingent would be this is your main backup if the first two fail. And an emergency is like this is when things have really gone south and you know we need something because our first three options have failed us, right? What I like about this, and I'll give an example of how that works, but what I like about this PACE planning is that it breaks down planning of different aspects into manageable chunks. Right? So you can start to say, okay, in this aspect, so if I want to do food preparation or food planning, what is my primary thing that I do every day? What's my alternate? And I can start thinking about those different topics without immediately going to doomsday. Oh my goodness, I can only carry 5 things in my backpack. What am I going to carry? Right? We can actually think about some of that. So if you've got a good solid primary alternate contingency plan in place, there's a strong possibility you may never need the emergency. And that's a great thing, but it's there just in case. So how does PACE sort of apply as we're going through the planning, and what does that look like? So I'm going to take the example of food security here, right? So like how do we prepare for how do we use PACE as we look at food preparation? So the primary would be like things we eat every day. I guarantee you for lunch, what you're doing right now, I see Kelly's cooking a little bit. She's using her primary method right here of eating food, right? Which is we go to grocery stores, we do weekly menu planning, we open up the refrigerator, There's stuff in the cupboards. I mean, that's our primary methodology, right? So that's not a problem. That's what we live every day, okay? So our alternate, if our primary is not available, the alternate, and these are some examples, like there's no food in the fridge. You open it up, and you're like, ah, there's nothing to eat in here but ketchup and baking soda. Ah, that's great, you know, or your pantry's a little bit bare, or maybe you accidentally burned dinner that night or something. What's your alternate, right? Some of the alternates that we have available are a grocery store run, or you can go to a restaurant. See, like the planning for these two aren't really that difficult, but, you know, as long as you have an idea of like what's there, okay, like, well, I know that if, you know, our tacos burned, there's always Chipotle down the street. That's great, not a problem, you know, or something like that. Now, where we get into, this is what we normally think about when we start thinking of contingency planning or emergency planning, and this is in the contingency part right here. So let's say grocery stores or restaurants are closed. Let's say that there was a power outage in your neighborhood or something like that, where power is down for like 8 hours and you can't really cook dinner. You had dinner planned, right? No problem. And so your primary failed because you can't really cook anything, because you know you have an electric stove or whatever. Your second option is like, okay, well, maybe we'll just go out and grab something to eat. Well, the power is out in the whole area, so restaurants aren't really open, so you can't do that. So you've burned through your primary and alternate. So what's your contingency? Well, maybe that's something like canned food or food storage that you have. You know, like maybe you can just say, okay, well, we've got some soup that we can sort of warm up on our gas stove, right? That's great. That's a contingency that you could use. I think a lot of the canning and food prep that a lot of people think about falls here in the contingency aspect, right? And this is where you start talking about like having a month, 3 months, 6 months worth of food. That's your contingency, right? If your primary and alternate don't work, there you go. Now, emergency, this would be like if you have no access to food, right? All the grocery stores are closed, or there's a food shortage or something like that. Food stores are running low. Maybe there's no power. Maybe you have to leave your place where you have all of your food storage. So let's say that there's a flood and you've got to get out of the house and you can't take all that food storage with you. That's an emergency then, right? That's a true emergency that you have to bring with you. And so some of the examples of food there are like maybe MREs, or, you know, kind of space food stuff, or emergency kits that you can bring with you, like a 72-hour kit type of thing. And so you can see that if you have a plan for each of these different levels, you're going to eliminate a lot of the worry and stress of getting into an emergency situation, because you have prepared yourself at each level with this, right? And so this is, I'm giving the food example as sort of a methodology that we can use, but as we go through a lot of the different categories, I think that this helps us break out different chunks. So, you know, like for example, I may not have to worry too much about primary and alternate. We live this in our lives every day, you know, every day, not a problem. But, you know, the contingency, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I think Lauren and I, we have discussed a lot more about how do we build up our contingency reserves and do things like that. And, you know, the thing is when we first started talking about it, and I started Googling, all of a sudden I was starting to get ads on my Facebook page about like emergency rations, you know, buy these kits. It's a 1-month kit that's self-packaged. I'm like, I don't really need these freeze-dried foods for the contingency thing. If I've planned well and I've built up my food storage, I don't need like to eat MREs for like a year type of thing. Nor do I probably want to eat MREs for a year, because I've had them and they're okay for a little bit, not in long-term quantities. So
I agree with that, Justin. I've survived in the woods with the MREs, and I don't ever care to eat another MRE in my life.
Right. Does anybody have any questions or comments about this PACE methodology?
One thing I think is important is if you're keeping a food storage, you need to try it out, some of the food, and see if it's actually food that you will actually eat in case of an emergency.
Yeah.
Because we've had some food and I would just rather throw it out than eat it. But
And
so we've kind of modified our food stores to things that we actually will eat.
well, and I think you bring up a good point, and we'll probably talk about that as we hit some of the food stuff. But I will talk about that a little bit. Is that a lot of the kits that people automatically think about? Okay, we'll just buy a 1 month food kit for our family, right? Well, a lot of the food in there may not be very good, right? And you're forced to eat something that you don't like. And that's if you're trying to use some of the emergency foods for your contingency plan. If you kind of come up with a good contingency plan and you're the one that is developing the menus and things like that for your canned food, your food storage, then you're going to like some of the stuff that you are buying and that you're preparing versus I just bought a box that has 30 meals in it and I don't know if I like half of them type of thing. So something to keep in mind as you like work through sort of this PACE methodology. Any other questions or comments before I move on?
Yeah, Justin.
Yeah.
Something here that would be important for some of us would be medications.
100%.
And it's very difficult. If you've just refilled a prescription, that's great. But if you're getting down towards the end of a prescription, you may have a problem. I don't know how you would prepare for that in the long run.
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, I've got a slide on here about medication that I want to touch on that. That is probably one of the trickiest things to do because obviously doctors don't want us to prescribe too much medication at once. But, let's say you've got a 90-day supply and you're down to your last 15 days and then something hits and it's difficult to get another 90-day supply. It's a little difficult. So it's something that we'll have to let's talk about that a little bit more when we get to the medical slide though. But I think that's a very good point, Brother Nate.
That's when you raid your local pharmacy.
Yeah, right. All right, so
I do have one thing, Justin, really quick on your case. I almost feel like there should be an S at the end for survival, where you're surviving off the land and you can eat a few things like bugs.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point, and I don't disagree with you. PACES might be a good acronym to use as well. The methodology that I'm sort of using here is less bushcraft, right, where you're actually out living in the bush and knowing what willow bark looks like because if you boil that down, that reduces fevers type of thing versus what plants you can eat, what plants you can't eat. And I mean, I think that that's all good and nice, but the vast majority of what we will end up doing and preparing for as an emergency, I would say, 99% of the time we're going to be able to be in our house, be next to where we are safe and secure in terms of shelter, excuse me, versus having to be out in the wilderness and survive. Now, if you are going out and you like to be in the woods and, you hike and stuff like that and somehow you get lost, I think having an understanding of bushcraft for those activities that you do is a good idea. All right, let's see. Sorry, what to plan for. All right, so what to plan for. Again, the idea is focus on what you can change instead of what you cannot. Instead of planning for, or instead of focusing on oh my goodness, this is a flood, or oh my goodness, this is an earthquake. What can we plan for that will help us get through many of the emergencies rather than focusing on the disaster itself. So here's several areas of focus that I want to talk about a little bit today. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I think it's somewhere that could get us started, in terms of being able to start talking about it and start planning for it. And I just put them in alphabetical order, so they're not in any kind of order of importance. I just put them in alphabetical order. So we can go through some of these and talk about some things to think about and some, areas that we should probably do it. Again, this presentation today isn't meant to be a deep dive on any one of these topics. As Mark had said earlier, I think that there might be some follow-on trainings where maybe we'll talk about food and water security. Maybe we'll talk about home protection. Maybe about stockpiling household goods or medical stuff, like whatever we need to talk about to dive into those a little bit in the future and maybe get some more subject matter experts. I do not claim to be an expert in this. I really don't. But in doing a lot of, I will say that as the coronavirus began and, things were very unknown in the beginning, I definitely felt a sense of unpreparedness myself for what was going on. And I think that there was a lot of fear and panic there. And I think that my own fear in the beginning was rooted in the fact that I probably was not as prepared as I should have been. So I started doing a lot of research. This is sort of where I've been coming up with this. So again, I'm by no means an expert. I'm just sort of sharing what I have learned so far. All right, so the first area of focus is communications. And when we talk about communications, like what do we normally use for communications in our everyday life?
It's always the phone.
Always the phone. In fact, I just got a notification that someone was at my door, right? So the phone is there constantly with us, right? And now these are interesting little devices because on any given day, they're totally fine, right? We can plug them in, we can charge them, we've got everything what we need. But what happens if has anyone ever forgot their phone at home for the day? Like what's happened? What was your day like for the rest of the day when you forgot your phone?
I felt like I was missing a limb. Like my hands didn't know what to do with themselves. I felt so disconnected and just felt like something bad is going to happen to me because I'm not going to be able to call anybody. Nobody's going to know where I am.
Right.
It is. It's so ingrained in us now.
Yeah. And I grew up in the 80s, 80s, early 90s was when I was younger. And I mean, none of us had a phone in our hands, right? You'd have to go home and make a phone call. And usually mom was on the phone and she'd give you the eyes, or my mom would snap her fingers at us and tell us to get out of the house, because she was talking to somebody. So we didn't have a phone to use half the time. And yet somehow with my friends, we always knew how to communicate and meet up and figure out where we're going to be. Like, I doubt we ever called each other. We just knew things, right? And so we become very reliant on the phones. And so the questions as we sort of talk about communications are, what happens if I don't have my phone? Like, what happens if the phones don't work? What happens if there's no power? There was an interesting situation that happened in 2013. It's when we had that derecho that came through Virginia, remember? And it knocked out all the cell phones, like for like a day. Like none of the cell phones were really working. And well, at least my network. I was on T-Mobile with Lauren, and none of our cell phones just couldn't connect to the network at all. And so I was supposed to go to a rugby game. I had the kids. She was supposed to meet up with me, but she didn't know how to get there. I had to leave a note at the house saying these are the directions, right, to get there, and I'm leaving. And she was upset at first because she's like, how come you never called me? How come you didn't understand? Like, how come you didn't reach me? And it was one of those things where like we literally couldn't communicate with each other through cell phones. So we had to come up with an alternate. So, as we're working through the PACE communication with this, we need to say, okay, what happens if we don't have a phone? What happens if, they don't work? What happens if there's no power? We've got to ask ourselves like this, if our primary is our phone, maybe the alternate is an email, right? You can send emails to each other. That might work if you're both at a computer or something like that. Maybe a contingency is a landline. Do we have landlines? Well, that maybe yes, maybe no. So maybe that is a viable or not viable option. I don't know a lot of other people that have landlines, right? Maybe it's radio. So, here's some things to consider in planning. do we have power supplies or charging things for this? I've seen cool little solar chargers for these cell phones. I mean, I'm sure it'll take a little while to charge them up, but you know, it's better than nothing if you don't have a power source to do it. So maybe that's a quick, easy way to make a contingency plan for power. Radios like walkie-talkies or ham radios, they both have their limitations. But maybe there's other communication methods like in-person visits, signals, notes that you can leave. You know, I mean, my friends and I, when we were growing up, we all just knew, all right, meet with your bikes after breakfast at this place. You know, like that was a form of communication. We knew to meet up there. And so maybe, you know, as you're working through like with neighbors or friends, you say, hey, if there's no communication and we want to check in on each other, meet at this location at this time every day, you know, or every other day, so that you kind of figure that out. So any questions or comments on communications? All right, cool. I think that this is an interesting topic as a deep dive because the ham radios and walkie-talkies are sort of becoming more popular as alternative communications, and there's a whole lesson. I mean, there's a lot of instruction, especially for ham radios, on sort of how to get into that and get up and running. So another day, another time for that area. All right, financial preparation, and I think that this is a huge one, as Brother Lowe was talking about. You know, a job loss is a very job loss is a very realistic personal emergency that we may be going through, right? And so some of the questions that we need to ask is, what would happen if I lost my job today? What would we do? What bills need to be paid versus what bills can we sort of downsize on? How long can I last without regular income? Right? If you ask yourself honestly those questions, I think that gives you a very good idea of where to start with it. So things to consider in planning. What's your lifestyle, needs and wants? I mean, we all have a lot of needs in our lives, but we also have probably more wants in our lives that we have. You know, do we really need that cable package if we're suffering a financial hardship? Or can we get rid of some of these things? Can we downsize some of those things? That will help us make it through financial hardships. And I think that if you come up with a plan that says, here's all the things here's our budget, right? That's the second bullet right there. There's our budget that we have. And if we were to lose our income, here's all the things that we would need to cancel or get rid of or cut out from our budget because they are extraneous types of things. And, you know, these are the core things that we should focus on. And that'll help give a very realistic of, you know, your financial needs as you need to continue going on. And then coming up with a good savings plan to just prepare to have a pool of money in case you need to survive on what your new budget is. And so the questions are, how much savings? Like, you know, how much do you need to save? Is there a benefit between savings versus investments, right? Savings may be in your bank account, but investments might be in real estate or stocks or something like that may be a little bit harder to get when you're in a financial emergency. What types of savings do you have? Do you have cash at the house? Do you have money in a bank account? Do you have precious metals, right, in a safety deposit box? Are they accessible? I mean, I think these are all types of things. Justin Pierce made a great point. He said, you know, a little while ago, he said it's a great it's a good thing you should always have about, you know, $200 to $400 in cash at the house, just in case, right? And just keep it in the house, keep it in a safe spot in case you need it. Because what if the banks don't work? What if the power's out and they can't communicate with our debit card? I mean, we pay with plastic and phones nowadays. I hardly ever carry cash in my wallet, and so, you know, do we have a backup just in case? And you know, there's a question of where to save. Do we put a lot of it in home? Do we move it when there's an emergency, just in case we need access to it? So I think you got to have a plan for all of that, right? And I'm not saying that there's any right or wrong answers here, but I think having a plan for financial preparedness is what's really the key. So, you know, like, what are your triggers? What do you want to do to make it through some of these things? Any questions, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I have a thought. So I guess if we have a major, you know, scenario where everyone's doesn't have financial means, I guess you could say. I guess the unknown is what will be the currency? Because will it be money, dollar bills, or will it be like gold or silver, or will it just be people just trading things?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that that's an interesting thought in terms of, like what happens. I think if currency breaks down, if the dollar's not accepted anymore, if our coins aren't accepted, we've got essentially a societal breakdown, right? Then that's where society is ceasing to function because government's not working. There's little or there's very little faith in the government being able to back up its currency type of thing. And in that instance, I mean, I think that it may be precious. It'll probably be precious metals type of thing, but it also could be foodstuffs. I mean, if food is scarce, that type of thing. It could be goods. I think it just depends. Now, I think that that's a pretty extreme scenario because that legitimately means that the government's completely kind of fallen apart if currency is no longer being accepted. I think what a more likely scenario is that you may have difficulties accessing your bank account, whether that be through power, whether it be through maybe internet's not working or something like that. How do you get to your bank account and your money there, right? That's a very real, very difficult thing to go through if you can't access that.
I mean, you initially said in the beginning that this would be more like emergency preparedness, more things that are more likely, not things that we see as much as like in movie scenarios.
Right.
And I just remember like this one time my mother-in-law, she was telling me how one of the activities the award did back in the day was to kind of try out their food storage. And what ended up happening was that a lot of people wanted sugar. They wanted some sweet things. I mean, so it just really depends, like, just work with the things that I think accommodate what you want for your family and just go from there.
Excellent points. Excellent points. And that kind of leads me into the next one, which is food, right? Food storage and food preparation. And we kind of talked about this in the PACE example, but the questions that we need to ask is like, A, how secure is our food source now? And I think Brother Call pointed out some interesting things that are going on right now is that there's a little bit of a shortage especially with meats, chicken and some of the beef, right? I know that a lot of farmers are having difficulties bringing their food from the farm to the market with the way that our food supply chain is. Some of the middlemen, it's difficult to get the food literally from the farm to the stores. And so, it's something that you have to keep an eye on. How secure is our food source at that moment? In terms of planning, you need to look at, in terms of planning, you need to look at how much food do we need to sustain ourselves. And so that's for you and your family, obviously, and you should ask yourself for 1 month, for 3 months, for 6 months, for 12 months, like what kinds of foods and how much food do we need to really sustain ourselves for that? And that'll sort of give you an idea. And again, this can feel very daunting in terms of planning and saving for all of this stuff, because the idea of putting 12 months of food storage in my house, especially all at once, I'm like, well, that's going to cost a lot of money to buy all of that food and prepare all of that food and get it ready for storage. I don't know if I've got the money or the time to do that, but if I can do 1 month at a time and build that up to 3 months, build that up to 6 months, I think that that's a much more manageable feat right there. So understanding sort of how to get to those points is really good. The other factor in terms of food storage is how much space do we have to store our food, and what kinds of things do we need to store. So this goes to both what Sister Lowe and Mark said. We have food preferences that we like to eat. Some of us have allergies. I'm actually allergic to whey, which is the protein in dairy, a protein in dairy. And so cheeses do not fly with me. Like I end up having like a sort of a, you know, swelling in my throat and stuff like that when I eat some of those types of things. And so I'm obviously not going to store a bunch of dairy type of stuff or cheese powder, like mac and cheese powder. Not good for me, but my kids love it, so I'll probably store tons of mac and cheese for them, but you know, none for me. So I've got to come up with a personalized food plan for like what works for me. So again, things to consider: start small. Start by building up a 2-week supply. Let that go to 1 month. Let that go to 3 months. You know, build that up over time. Think about perishable versus non-perishable. You know, it's great to stock the freezer and all that, but during that same derecho that we had in 2013, we had a friend who had a giant chest freezer. It was like a 6-foot chest freezer, and all of their meat went bad because they didn't have power for 10 days, right? So they lost all of that meat, and it just wasn't sustainable. It's great normal times, but you know, thinking about perishable versus non-perishable, storage, you know, canning versus bulk food storage, MREs, longevity, like all of those types of things should go into your planning for it. And this food thing, again, this is a whole lesson unto itself. And I just want to touch on it, you know, do a cursory topic about it, but I think that there's this is where a lot of people also think about preparation is they mainly go to food storage, and that's probably because of our Mormon culture that we have. So let's see. Home protection. So when I say home protection, a lot of people automatically think about firearms and guns and things like that. Well, I think that that's like one step of it. Yeah, look at that knife. I love it. So you got Brother Nick's over there. He's got an arsenal in his house, clearly, an armory, and which is great. But you need to ask yourselves, how secure is your house, right? And the real question is like, what can you do to your home to keep people out? Because obviously, if you have a firearm, if you have knives, if you have protection and things like that, you want to try to use those as a last resort. The idea is, how do you deter people from coming in the first place, right? And keep them out. So the other question is, do you want a firearm if you don't have it already? And I'm not going to answer that question for you. I'm not going to tell you that you should have it. It's something you have to ask yourself. So things to consider when you're planning. Take a look around your house. How easy is it for someone to get into your house? You know, doors, windows, etc. Like, identify maybe some weak spots. Maybe you need to upgrade the lock system on your doors. Maybe you need to make sure that the doors are locked all night. You know, I mean, that's probably step one. There was a show that was on, oh man, I don't even remember what the channel was. Probably Discovery Channel. It was called To Catch a Thief, I think, or something like that. And it was this kind of retired thief, burglar, and a security expert. And they would go to these houses and they'd identify these houses and they'd say, hey, we want to try to break into your house and show you where like security weaknesses are. Are you cool with that? And they'd say, yeah, sure. They said, all right, fine, just live your life and we'll try to break into your house. And they would find a way every time. And almost inevitably, it was like somebody left an upstairs window like unlocked. And they didn't even have to break in. They just lifted the window and they would walk in, right? So are we securing our house the way that we need to secure it? Like, what are the safe rooms in your house? So if there's a tornado, do you know where everybody should go? What's a safe room, right? If there is somebody that enters your house and you're upstairs, what's the safe room upstairs that you should go to? You should think about some of these different plans. In terms of firearms, you need to figure out what's for you, some of the best home defense arms, and what you think is good. Take some training, familiarize yourself with your firearms, go to a range, go shooting with some friends. I would not suggest, if you're a new gun owner, just buying a firearm and keeping it loaded under your bed and never using it. Like, I would never suggest that. You should always get familiar with it and use it and figure out how it works and get comfortable with it, and get enough of the right ammunition for it. Any comments or questions on home protection?
What's the best home protection?
You want my opinion? Is probably a Mossberg 500 shotgun with, believe it or not, with birdshot. not
that
buckshot.
that must be pump action.
Yeah, pump action shotgun. Yep.
Okay.
And the reason why I like a shotgun is that it's easy to shoot. You don't have to, like, pistols are much harder to be accurate than with a shotgun. And I like birdshot in it versus buckshot because buckshot tends to go through walls very easily. So birdshot less so.
Hey, Justin.
Yeah.
I liked how you started this out with the PACE method, and I think it's good to remember that with all that we're doing. So, you know, it's easy, like you're saying, it's easy to jump the gun, like home protection and, oh, what kind of gun should I have? But start with, the first was the plan, right? You know, if there's a fire in the house somewhere, if you're located here, what is the plan? Where's our family going to go? What room? And start there before we get to the, you know, start at the more common situations and then move.
Yeah.
There.
So no, that's a great point, love. The primary, you know, if you're looking at the PACE, the primary might be I go around every night at 10 o'clock to make sure that the doors are locked. Right? That's probably my primary way of securing the house. Make sure my doors are locked at night. Right? That's a great way of doing it. Maybe a secondary is having an alarm system in your house. You know, and again, I'm not advocating you should do what's good for you, but maybe that's a secondary, or that's the alternative, is having the alarm system, you know. And then a contingency is, you know, having a dog or having a firearm or something like that. So, you know, I think having those plans in place and understanding kind of the different levels that you go through are sort of the key to being able to have a good plan and manage your stress and anxiety in the moment. And I think that that's super key right there, because if you have a plan, you're not going to freak out. You still may freak out a little bit, but you're not going to totally freak out. I'm just going to run over this real quick. Household goods. These are things like cleaning supplies, soap, shampoo, contacts, hand sanitizer, toilet paper. You know, a lot of these have good shelf lives, but the question is storage. You know, you just kind of need to go through and ask yourself, what do you need to be healthy and happy? What are things that you can live with and live without? I mean, really, when it comes down to it, if you were in an emergency situation, we could live without deodorant. We could do it, right? Our ancestors did it forever. Kelly, you can do it. You can do it. Now, am I asking you to do it? No, please plan for it. Please plan for it. But
just make note to stay away from the Smiths.
Exactly. No, I will personally be getting a lot of deodorant, you know, as we plan for it. But I'm just saying that, you know, as you work through your primary, alternate, contingency, emergency, like, you know, you start to say, what can we live with and what can we live without? Can we start doing things and make it more sustainable? Lauren and I looked at, you know, possibly making our own laundry detergent, you know, as we move forward. And is that sustainable? And so, you know, I mean, there might be alternative ways other than like running to the grocery store to picking something up. And I think that that's sort of what this section is about, is are there things that we can do to go pick up things without doing it? So, all right. Medical. This gets to what Brother Nick was saying. So, medication, I've got that called out directly right here. Do you have long-term supplies of critical medication? And do you have a good supply of over-the-counter medications? So that's Advil, aspirin, you know, allergy medication, whatever it is. But, you know, your personal medication, I think that it may be a good opportunity to talk with your doctor and say, you know, we are living right now in a coronavirus pandemic, and fortunately, it's not nearly as bad as it could be, right? It could be a lot worse where we can't even go out, period. And pharmacies are closed and things are closed. So what is, you know, maybe the conversation with your doctor could be, what can we do to ensure that I have long-term medication if we have to go an extra, if we go an extra few months between prescriptions, you know, and have that chat with him. And you know, maybe he's got a good solution for you. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately. I will say that this is going to be a good plug right here for having a good first aid kit in your house. If you just have one of those tiny little car first aid kit things in your house, and that's your primary first aid kit, this should be a primary thing that you upgrade. You know, you need to look at the size and quality of your first aid kit. Does it have enough for you? Does it have enough for you and your family? And what about some of your neighbors, right? Does it have the right things in it? I mean, a huge first aid kit with a bunch of those little tiny circle band-aids that are stuck in it isn't going to do you much when, you know, you've got to make a splint, or you've got to maybe even do some stitches. I mean, you know, if worst comes to worst, we could do it if we had to, right? If there was no hospital. You know, I mean, having the right types of things in there. Do you have Neosporin? Do you have allergy medication? Do you have an EpiPen that's in there, you know, just in case there's something that happens? Like putting those types of things in your first aid kit. And there's a lot of online resources about building out good first aid kits, but this is much like the food storage. Getting a very good, large and quality first aid kit takes time, right? It's something that you should build up, because you could easily go out and spend $1,000 on first aid stuff to get your stuff. So yeah, any questions, comments?
Yeah, Justin.
Yeah.
One of my medications is so heavily regulated that there's just no way under federal law I could get an advanced refill.
Yeah.
And so I just recommend you all stay away from me when I run out of that stuff, because then I start acting really weird.
You mean weirder, right? Weirder?
Weirdest.
We'll have to take away all his guns.
It might be a good time to look at some, I mean, I can't say this with all medications. I mean, that doesn't apply, but it might be good to look at some more natural solutions in emergency. You know, don't rely on it, but have more of those natural solutions. That doesn't work with everything, but just a thought.
And if we're looking at emergency, so this is way emergency stuff, but you know, I mean, knowing a little bit of plants and things like that, so like dandelions, like you can boil that up for like a great tea that'll settle stomachs, you know, if you get food poisoning or you're feeling sick or something like that. So, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, this is bushcraft emergency type stuff, but knowing a little bit about that kind of thing may help as well. All right, transportation. This is a pretty easy one. Listen, our cars, they run on fuel, which is a finite resource. You know, that fuel is delivered to the gas stations. If there's a supply issue, if there's, you know, whether or not it's oil getting to the gas station or the refineries, or, you know, the gas getting to the gas stations, or even the gas stations into our car, there's a supply chain that could easily be disrupted. And if that happens, do we have alternate methods of travel? I mean, maybe the alternate for us, like if our car breaks down, I mean, we could get into an accident. There's an emergency for us. What's our alternate instead of our primary? Well, maybe you could take the bus. Maybe you could get a ride with somebody, that type of thing. But if you're thinking about contingency and emergency, you know, you've got to think about like your ability to get around. Like, what if roads are closed? What if, you know, what if it's impossible to travel, flooding type of thing? So you got to think about ways that you could get around if you need to. Maybe it'll be bike, maybe it'll be walking. You know, maybe you got to find somebody with a boat. I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there. But you know, you also should think about distances to key locations. So maybe like, how far is it to the store? How far is it to friends or family? How far is it to the church? If we need to meet up there for some reason. Think about those types of distances. And like, I know for some of us, like, you know, I'm not used to walking 5 miles at a time, like, you know, just straight. And so maybe I need to build up a little bit of stamina and, you know, endurance to be able to start doing that on a regular in case something happens. So, and I hate riding bikes. That's like the worst thing ever, but my wife is a good bike rider. So, you know.
Good idea is keep your gas tank full. When it gets down to half, go fill it up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know what? You know what's interesting? about that, Brother Carl, is that I told Lauren that when this thing started, I was like, okay, we should probably start keeping our gas tanks never less than half full, right? And I started thinking about that. I'm like, well, shouldn't that be the way anyway? Like, in case, I mean, we sort of saw this slow rolling disaster coming at us, which was, the coronavirus. But what would happen if tomorrow, like, there's a, earthquake and there's no gas, and all of a sudden I didn't keep enough gas in my gas tank? Well, that's kind of, I did it to myself, right? So I think that's a very good point, Brother Call. This is the last topic really that I put up there, water. And they asked the question, this is an easy one for a lot of people, is like, what happens if I don't have access to clean water? And I don't think we have as many problems here as like in Florida, for example. When Florida has a hurricane, a lot of their clean water just, I mean, it's gone. Like there's so much water that comes up through the sewage pipes and things like that, that like houses get flooded and it taints a lot of the water that's there. So they've got to have a lot of different backups. But what happens in Virginia that I've noticed a lot is that water lines break out here quite a bit. And I mean, we've all gotten boil water advisories for, several days, several times, even living here in Virginia. I've seen it all over the DC metro area. So, yeah. So, So the question is, do we have access to clean water? And clean water means drinkable water, in my opinion, right? And the other question is what kind of water do I need for certain activities? So, like, if I'm washing the dog, do I need drinkable water for that? Probably not. You know what I mean? Now, do I want to wash him in pond scum water? Probably not. So, like, do I have a way to sort of filter it and clean it out? I can figure that type of stuff out. So, things to consider in planning. So, like storage. How do you store water? There's big barrels that you could have. There's water bottles. There's jugs. There's different things like that. What about water filters? There's plenty of water filtration kits, and I see that Brother Moulter said he's got a 400-gallon pond in his backyard, but he wouldn't want to drink from it. Well, if you had a filtration kit and you were desperate enough, I guarantee you probably would, right? And like if you didn't have access to any other water, even as nasty as it is, but you can figure that out. I don't know if you guys seen those things called life straws. They sell them at Walmart for like $5. You can literally stick that in a river and drink out of it from a straw, and it filters it in real time. Now, yeah, go ahead.
So the thing about water filters is that it really depends on the filter size. Yep. So things like life straw, they actually they do get rid of like protozoans. So like things like cryptosporidium and like those type of things that can give you some pretty bad issues, but it doesn't filter out some viruses that are still bad for you.
Right.
So
you have to kind of do your homework on those things, and there are certain risks associated with the different kinds of filters. And
yeah, I mean, so for like cruise ships, noroviruses are kind of a big issue because it causes a lot of stomach issues, stomach irritability issues. And so filtration size does matter when it comes to finding the right water filter.
Those are great points. Thank you for making them. And I think you're absolutely right. And for example, and let me put it this way. If you're using a life straw, you're probably in more of that emergency case rather than like a contingency one, right? Where like you really need water. And the question is okay, the chance, I may get a virus, but I desperately need water. If I don't get water, I might die in like a day or two, right? Type of thing. So I absolutely agree. Do your research, make your decisions the way that you need to. I think that this is another topic that we can talk about because like we have a big water barrel that we can fill up, and there's ways to treat it to make sure that it stays good for a certain amount of time, but you got to change it out. You got to kind of figure out what that is. So yeah, proximity to water source. Do you have like stream, lake, pond, rainwater? I mean, if you can figure out how to filtrate that and then maybe even boil it, even better. That is a water source that you could have. So, you know, I guess we'll all see each other down at Lake Montclair getting water jugs, right? There. Anyway, you got to figure out how much water do you need a day. There's online calculators for that you can figure out. And then like what activities need water: drinking, dishes, brushing teeth, showers. What kind of activities need potable water that, you know, is healthy to drink, and what kind of activities don't need potable water for that as well. So, yep. Yeah, so just as a quick wrap up for all of this, I think the key takeaways here is that everyone can begin emergency planning, like no matter what your situation is. If you live in an apartment, in a townhouse, in a regular, you know, a single family house, if you don't have a lot of money, if you have tons of money, I think you can start your emergency planning no matter what, and start to tailor a plan that's going to fit for you. You need to, you know, start by taking inventory of where you are in some of these different aspects of it. And I think that if you use the PACE methodology, you can start to begin to identify weaknesses in your plan that you can then bolster up. Work with people in the community. I think that our ward is one of the, you know, looking at our society as a whole, if we look at our ward, I mean, the fact that we're having this meeting here shows that we have one of our most foundational support groups here in our geographical area. And the other thing too is to talk with some of your neighbors. So, I mean, our ward is local, but our neighbors are hyper local. You know, I mean, if you can come up and maybe say, hey, let's go in together on building a garden. Let's go in together on saving up water, you know, and maybe that provides some opportunities and solutions to collaborate together to help do some planning. I started earlier this year, or actually it was about a month and a half ago, the Dale City Preppers Club Facebook group. It's a closed group because I didn't want the entire like world knowing that we're doing, you know, preparation type stuff. And it's a fun play on preppers. I mean, preppers think about, you know, bunkers and you know, survivalist stuff. But really, it's to talk about all these topics that we talk about today. In fact, I got most of this stuff from the handbook that I had started putting out and we're kind of collectively working on. And if you would like an invitation to that, make sure that we're friends on Facebook and just hit me up and let me know. Because I will, you know, I can let you in as a closed group and we'll make sure that you get to be a part of it. So it's a place to ask questions. I know that, like, for example, Casey Van Camp was saying he was interested in learning more about hydroponics. And I think Brother Lowe was posting some interesting things about, you know, growing hydroponic type stuff. Or maybe I got that backwards, Brother Lowe. Either way, you two were talking about it. And yeah, let's make a plan. Make a plan for you and your family, and then we just got to get after it, you know, and actually put it into action. Take small bite-sized chunks because that's the only way that you're going to do it. So yeah, that's pretty much my presentation. If anybody has any questions or thoughts to add before we sign out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll wrap it up, Justin, if you.
Okay.
Okay. Any more questions for Justin? I did post my little 2 cents on a Tesla coil water purification system.
That's right.
Look into that. It'll be the most purified water you'll ever have. Well, thank you, Justin, for this wonderful lesson on. I can't really say it's doomsday preparation, so it's emergency preparedness. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's all right. It was a sexy title that sold high attendance.
Well, appreciate everybody joining us.